for the murder of your two...
They were annoying anyway. Can we go?
That is enough! Your coldness is noted. This court sentences you to death.
On October 30th, 2024, in the affluent coastal community of Del Mar Heights in San Diego, California, 12-year-old Jessica Hermar murdered her two younger sisters, 9-year-old Nicole and 10-year-old Leslie, using her father's hunting rifle in a densely wooded ravine less than half a mile from their home. The girls had left their home that afternoon, with Jessica telling their mother they were going to build a secret fort in Torrey Pines Extension Reserve, a small nature preserve that bordered their neighborhood. What their parents couldn't have known was that Jessica had carefully planned this outing, having researched how to operate her father's rifle and deliberately selecting a location where the dense California coastal trees would muffle the sound of gunshots. If you're watching this video, please hit the subscribe button to follow more true crime stories like this one. We'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop your location in the comments below. Jessica had been meticulous in her preparation, stealing the key to her father's gun safe 3 days earlier and practicing opening it when her parents were out. The morning of the murders, while her mother was on a conference call and her father was at work, she removed the Remington bolt-action rifle from the safe, loaded it according to instructions she had searched for online, and concealed it in her father's large canvas duffel bag. She selected ammunition that would be lethal but not overly powerful, demonstrating an understanding of firearms that was chilling for someone her age. Jessica's preparation extended beyond just taking the weapon, as she had researched the park's layout online and identified a small clearing over 100 yards off the main trail where they would be unlikely to be seen or heard by other visitors. The day was typical for Southern California in late October, mild, sunny, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of eucalyptus and sage through the park's winding trails. Jessica led her unsuspecting sisters through the familiar pathways they had explored many times before, but today they ventured deeper into the ravine than they had ever gone. Nicole and Leslie were excited about building their secret fort, carrying small shovels and decorations in their own backpacks, unaware that their sister was guiding them to a predetermined location for murder. As they reached the clearing Jessica had selected, she suggested they put down their backpacks and look for branches to build their fort, ensuring her sisters' backs were turned as she unzipped the duffel bag and removed the rifle. According to the forensic reconstruction of events, Jessica first shot Leslie in the back of the head at close range, killing her instantly as she was gathering sticks about 15 feet away. Nicole, hearing the gunshot, turned toward her sister in confusion and fear, only to be shot in the chest as she began to run. The second shot didn't kill Nicole immediately, and evidence suggests Jessica approached her wounded sister, who was attempting to crawl away, and fired a final shot to her head. Park visitors reported hearing what they thought were 3 firecrackers or car backfires around 4:15 p.m., but due to the ravine's acoustics and the thick tree coverage, they couldn't pinpoint the location or recognize the sounds as gunshots. After ensuring both her sisters were dead, Jessica placed the rifle back in the duffel bag, covered the bodies with branches and leaves in a cursory attempt to hide them, and walked home alone. When Jessica returned home around 5:30 p.m., she told her mother that her sisters had wanted to stay at the park longer, and she had gotten bored and left them playing. Her demeanor was described by her mother as unusually calm, though Sarah Hermar didn't immediately register this as suspicious. As the evening progressed and her sisters didn't return home, Jessica participated in the initial search efforts, even suggesting places in the park to look, deliberately directing family and neighbors away from the actual location of the bodies. By nightfall, with Nicole and Leslie still missing, Michael and Sarah Hermar called the police, initiating a search that would continue through the night and into the next morning, with Jessica maintaining her story that she had simply left her sisters playing in the park. The discovery came at 7:38 a.m. on October 31st, when Margaret Chen, a regular morning jogger, veered off the main trail to investigate what she initially thought was discarded clothing, and discovered the partially covered bodies of the two girls. The 911 call she made was played later at trial, her voice shaking, as she told the dispatcher, "I found them, oh God. I found two little girls, and they're not moving." San Diego Police Department officers secured the scene immediately, and detectives quickly identified the victims as the missing Hermar sisters. The murder weapon was discovered approximately 50 yards from the bodies, hastily concealed in the canvas duffel bag and covered with fallen leaves, a critical mistake that would later link Jessica directly to the crime. Detective Noah Anderson, a 15-year veteran of the San Diego Police Department's homicide unit, arrived at the scene by 8:20 a.m. and immediately noted several concerning details. The position of the bodies and the precision of the head wounds suggested the shooter had been comfortable with the victims, getting close enough for accurate shots without causing alarm. The presence of the duffel bag, later identified as belonging to Michael Hermar, raised immediate questions about how the girls had accessed the rifle, which their father kept in a locked gun safe. Most disturbing to Anderson was the attempted concealment of the bodies, not thorough enough to prevent discovery, but deliberate enough to suggest the killer wanted to delay it, pointing to a perpetrator who understood the implications of their actions. As the crime scene, investigators processed the ravine clearing. The Hermar family was notified of the devastating discovery, their grief quickly turning to confusion when detectives mentioned the rifle. Michael Hermar, overcome with emotion, rushed to check his gun safe, finding it locked but empty, the rifle missing, but no signs of forced entry. This revelation turned the investigation in an unexpected direction, as detectives realized that whoever took the rifle had either known the combination to the safe or had access to the key. Jessica, who had been sitting quietly on the living room sofa while her parents received the news, showed minimal emotional reaction, a detail that several officers present would later testify seemed unusual, even allowing for shock. The San Diego Medical Examiner's Office determined that both girls had died between 4 and 4:30 p.m. the previous day, consistent with the reported sounds heard by park visitors. Leslie had died instantly from a single gunshot wound to the occipital lobe, while Nicole had suffered a non-fatal chest wound before receiving a fatal shot to the temple, suggesting she had attempted to flee or had witnessed her sister's murder before being shot herself. Ballistics confirmed that both girls had been killed by bullets from the same rifle found at the scene, a Remington 700 registered to Michael Hermar, which he used occasionally for hunting trips in the mountains east of San Diego. The precision of the shot suggested someone with steady hands who was either familiar with the weapon or had studied its operation. Jessica's initial statements to police maintained her innocence, claiming she had left her sisters building a fort and gone home alone. But her story began to show inconsistencies when detectives asked for specific details. She couldn't explain why she had separated from her sisters when they had been excited about a project they were working on together, nor could she account for the significant time gap between when she claimed to have left them and when she arrived home. Most tellingly, Jessica described the location where she had left her sisters as being just a little way off the main trail. Yet the bodies were found in a clearing that required navigating several unmarked paths to reach, a discrepancy that suggested she either knew exactly where her sisters had died or had led them there herself. Nicole and Leslie Hermar were bright, vibrant children whose lives were intertwined not just by blood, but by a genuine friendship that many siblings never achieve. 9-year-old Nicole, a fourth grader at Del Mar Heights Elementary, was known for her artistic ability and compassionate nature, often spending weekends volunteering with her mother at the local animal shelter, where she would draw portraits of dogs awaiting adoption to help them find homes. Her teachers described her as intellectually curious and emotionally intuitive, noting that she often mediated conflicts among her classmates with a wisdom beyond her years. Nicole's bedroom walls were covered with her artwork, watercolor landscapes of the San Diego coastline, portraits of her family members, and detailed drawings of the animals she hoped to help as a veterinarian, the career she had already set her heart on. 10-year-old Leslie, in 5th grade at the same school, was the athlete of the family, excelling in soccer and swimming, with a natural grace that led her dance instructor to suggest she had potential for serious ballet training. With her quick wit and outgoing personality, Leslie made friends easily and was often the center of a boisterous group of children at neighborhood gatherings, organizing games and adventures for everyone to enjoy. She kept a journal found in her room after her death that revealed a thoughtful young girl who wrote poetry about the ocean and made lists of goals that ranged from make the competitive swim team to help people who don't have enough food. Both girls shared a love of reading, maintaining a joint book nook in their room with shelves of adventures they'd read together, taking turns voicing different characters. The sisters' close relationship was evident in family photos that lined the Hermar home. Nicole and Leslie building sandcastles at Torrey Pine State Beach, huddled together over a tide pool examining sea creatures, or dressed in matching outfits for holiday portraits, their arms wrapped around each other with genuine affection. Friends of the family remarked that the girls were rarely seen apart, sharing not just activities but confidences, with Leslie acting as a protective older sister while benefiting from Nicole's emotional insights. Their bond extended to a private language of inside jokes and code words that their parents sometimes couldn't decipher, a sisterly shorthand, developed over years of shared experiences and mutual trust that made them not just siblings, but best friends. Sarah and Michael Hermar had encouraged this close relationship, creating family traditions that celebrated their daughter's individuality while fostering their connection to each other. Every Sunday evening was Sister Showcase Night, where Nicole would display artwork she had created during the week, and Leslie would perform a dance routine or read a poem she had written, with their parents offering specific, thoughtful praise for each girl's unique talents. The Hermars believed in recognizing each child's distinct personality rather than treating them as a unit, a parenting approach that made the sisters secure enough in their parents' love to support rather than compete with each other. This philosophy was evident in how they had designed the girls' shared bedroom, divided into clearly personalized spaces that reflected their different interests, but with a common area in the center where they could come together. The absence of Jessica from most family photographs and activities now seemed, in retrospect, like a warning sign that had been missed amid the busy routine of daily life. Where Nicole and Leslie moved through the world together, Jessica increasingly orbited at a distance, declining invitations to family beach outings or retreating to her room during game nights. School counselors would later reveal that Jessica had begun refusing to participate in family therapy sessions recommended after she had shown signs of aggression toward her sisters, telling the counselor, "They talk about their feelings too much. It's stupid." The contrast between the vibrant, connected lives of Nicole and Leslie and the isolated path Jessica had chosen made their deaths all the more tragic. Two children who embodied joy and potential, whose futures were erased by the sister who couldn't bear to see them shine. In the days following the murders, the Del Mar Heights community gathered for a candlelight vigil at the elementary school playground, where Nicole and Leslie had spent countless recess periods laughing and playing. More than 300 people attended, including classmates, teachers, neighbors, and even strangers moved by the tragedy, creating a sea of flickering lights against the darkening California sky as the sun set over the Pacific. Children placed handmade cards and artwork on a memorial table alongside photos of the sisters, while adults who had known them shared stories that painted a picture of two extraordinary young lives. Mrs. Reynolds, Nicole's art teacher, displayed a watercolor painting Nicole had completed just days before her death. A sunset over the ocean, with two boats sailing side by side toward the horizon, a work that now seemed hauntingly prescient. The loss of Nicole and Leslie created ripples that extended far beyond their immediate family, affecting everyone who had known their kindness and witnessed their joy. Their soccer coach, David Mercer, established a scholarship in Leslie's name for young athletes who demonstrated exceptional sportsmanship, saying through tears at the memorial, "Leslie understood that how you play matters more than if you win." The animal shelter where Nicole had volunteered created a special adoption program called Nicole's Angels, featuring her artwork on their materials and continuing her mission of finding homes for overlooked pets. The impact of their brief lives was measured not just in personal achievements, but in how they had touched others. The classmate who spoke of how Nicole had sat with her every day when she was new to the school, the elderly neighbor who described how Leslie had organized a team of kids to help clear her yard after a storm. At their funeral, held at St. James Catholic Church in Solana Beach, the white casket seemed impossibly small against the backdrop of stained glass and solemn architecture. Michael Hermar, supported by family members as he struggled to maintain his composure, spoke of his daughter's different personalities but shared capacity for joy. Nicole noticed everything: the changing colors in a sunset, the feelings someone was trying to hide, the perfect detail that made her artwork come alive. Leslie lived at full speed, throwing herself into every experience with a fearlessness that made us proud and terrified at the same time. Sarah Hermar, too grief-stricken to speak at length, simply shared a recent memory of finding the girls asleep in Nicole's bed, books scattered around them, their hands still clasped after reading together late into the night, saying, "That's how I'll always remember them, connected, peaceful, exactly where they wanted to be." What made the loss of Nicole and Leslie even more incomprehensible was the ordinary beauty of the lives they had been living, lives filled with homework and dance recitals, arguments over whose turn it was to feed the family cat, and secret wishes written in diaries. They had been planning their Halloween costumes. Nicole was going to be a famous artist, complete with a beret and paintbrush, while Leslie had chosen to dress as an Olympic swimmer with a medal she had crafted from gold paper. The backpacks found at the crime scene contained these partially completed costumes, along with the materials they had brought to build their fort: colored string to mark the boundaries, small solar-powered garden lights to illuminate the space, and a waterproof container holding a secret sister's notebook where they recorded ideas and plans. The mundane treasures of childhood stood in stark contrast to the violence that had ended their lives, making their absence from the world all the more profound. The psychological impact on the children who had known Nicole and Leslie was immediately apparent and deeply concerning to parents and school officials. Nightmares, anxiety about playing outdoors, and fear of separation from parents became common among their classmates and friends, prompting the school district to bring in child psychologists to help students process their grief and fear. One child psychologist who worked with the students noted that the fact that the killer was another child, and worse, the victim's own sister, had shattered their sense of safety in a way that was particularly difficult to address. Children understand monsters in movies or bad guys on TV, but they struggle to comprehend how someone their own age, someone who was supposed to love her sisters, could do something so terrible, explained Dr. Marcia Levine, who counseled many of the students at Delmar Heights Elementary in the months following the murders. The lives of Nicole and Leslie Hermar would eventually be reduced to court exhibits and testimony, their personalities dissected for clues about why their sister had wanted them dead, but those who had known them fought to preserve the fullness of who they had been. Their teachers compiled books of their schoolwork, Nicole's stories and artwork, Leslie's science projects, and journal entries, creating archives of two interrupted childhoods that showed not just what had been lost, but what might have been. Friends shared memories on a website created by a neighbor, building a digital monument to two girls who had embodied the best of childhood, curiosity, kindness, and the capacity for uncomplicated joy. In a community stunned by violence, remembering Nicole and Leslie as they lived rather than how they died became an act of resistance against the darkness that had claimed them. The investigation into the murders of Nicole and Leslie Hermar began at 9:17 p.m. on October 30th, 2024, when Sarah Hermar made a frantic call to the San Diego Police Department, reporting that her two youngest daughters had not returned from playing in the park near their home. The 911 dispatcher's recording captured Sarah's escalating panic as she explained that the girls had left home around 3:30 p.m. with their older sister Jessica, who had returned alone, claiming the younger girls had wanted to stay and play. "We've searched everywhere," Sarah told the dispatcher, her voice breaking. "It's dark now, and they know they're supposed to be home before dark." The dispatcher, recognizing the seriousness of the situation involving two missing children as night fell, immediately escalated the call to priority status, dispatching patrol officers to the Hermar home and initiating a search of Torrey Pines Extension Reserve. Officers arrived at the Spanish-style home on Mercado Drive at 9:32 p.m., finding Michael and Sarah Hermar preparing to return to the park with flashlights after an initial search had yielded no sign of their daughters. Officer Elena Rodriguez, first on the scene, noted in her report that while the parents appeared genuinely distraught, 12-year-old Jessica seemed detached from the crisis, sitting on the living room sofa, texting on her phone. When Rodriguez asked Jessica directly about when she had last seen her sisters, the girl responded without looking up from her phone. "They were being annoying, so I left them playing by some trees." This casual dismissal of her missing sisters struck Rodriguez as unusual, prompting her to make a note in her preliminary report about Jessica's concerning affect that would later become significant to the investigation. As midnight approached with no sign of Nicole and Leslie, the San Diego Police Department expanded the search, bringing in K-9 units and asking residents of the neighboring communities to check their yards and outbuildings. Michael Hermar led one search team through the park's main trails, while Sarah remained home in case the girls returned on their own. Jessica claimed fatigue and went to bed around 11:30 p.m., a decision that seemed incomprehensible to her parents given the circumstances, but which they attributed to shock. The search continued through the night, with volunteers from the community joining police officers to comb through the dense chaparral and eucalyptus groves that characterized the Ibar Reserve, calling the girls' names and searching with powerful flashlights that sent beams dancing through the darkness of the coastal forest. Dawn broke over San Diego County with still no sign of the missing sisters, and the police department officially classified the case as a critical missing persons investigation, allocating additional resources and notifying regional law enforcement agencies. Jessica, appearing rested despite the crisis unfolding around her, was asked by Detective Noah Anderson to guide a search team to the exact location where she had last seen her sisters. The girl led officers along a main trail before pointing vaguely toward a densely wooded area, saying, "Somewhere over there, I think." When pressed for more specific information, Jessica became visibly annoyed, telling Anderson, "I already told you. I left because they were being babies about building the fort." Her apparent lack of concern continued to disturb the officers involved, with one noting in his report that Jessica seemed more inconvenienced than worried about her missing sisters. The breakthrough in the search came not from Jessica's directions, but from Margaret Chen, a software engineer who regularly jogged through the reserve before work. Veering slightly off her usual path to avoid a section of trail muddied by recent landscape irrigation, Chen spotted what appeared to be clothing partially covered by branches and fallen leaves in a small clearing. Drawing closer, she realized with horror that she was looking at the bodies of two young girls, positioned side by side with their hands nearly touching, as if even in death they sought connection with each other. Chen, her hands shaking so badly she could barely operate her phone, called 911 at 7:38 a.m., staying on the line with the dispatcher until the first patrol officers arrived at the scene 6 minutes later, securing the area and beginning the process that would transform a missing persons case into a homicide investigation. The crime scene in the wooded ravine told a story of calculated violence that shocked even veteran homicide detectives. The position of the bodies and the wound patterns indicated that Leslie had been shot first, from behind, suggesting she had been unaware of the danger until the moment the bullet struck her. Nicole's wounds, one to the chest and one to the head, along with the blood trail leading from her initial position, painted a horrific picture of a child who had witnessed her sister's murder, attempted to flee, and been pursued by her killer. Detective Anderson, examining the scene with growing dread, noted the precision of the head wounds, unusual in cases involving untrained shooters, and the deliberate but incomplete attempt to hide the bodies. Whoever did this wanted the bodies to be found eventually, he noted in his report, but they needed enough time to establish distance from the crime. The discovery of Michael Hermar's canvas duffel bag, partially concealed under fallen leaves approximately 50 yards from the bodies, provided the first major physical evidence in the case. Crime scene technician Jasmine Patel carefully documented the bag's position before opening it to reveal a Remington 700 bolt-action rifle, still containing one unfired round in the chamber. The rifle's presence at the scene immediately raised critical questions. How had it been removed from Michael Hermar's locked gun safe? Who among the family or their acquaintances knew how to operate this specific weapon? Why would someone bring the rifle to a remote location where two young girls were playing? Patel meticulously photographed and collected the weapon, applying specialized techniques to preserve potential fingerprint and DNA evidence that might identify the person who had handled the rifle. When Detectives Anderson and his partner, Detective James Wilson, returned to the Hermar home to notify the family of the discovery, they deliberately separated family members to observe their initial reactions. Sarah Hermar collapsed upon hearing the news, requiring medical attention for acute shock, while Michael fell to his knees, repeating, "No, no, not my babies," in a voice barely above a whisper. Jessica's reaction, however, struck both detectives as atypical for a child who had just learned of her sister's deaths. She remained seated on the living room sofa, her expression unchanging as she asked, "Are you sure it's them?" When Anderson confirmed the identification, Jessica nodded once and said, "I should have made them come home with me," a statement that seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous in its delivery. The mention of the rifle found at the scene prompted an immediate reaction from Michael Hermar, who rushed to check his gun safe, finding it locked but empty. Returning to the detectives, visibly shaken, he explained that the rifle was a hunting weapon he kept secured in a combination-locked safe in his home office closet. "Only Sarah and I know the combination," he insisted, though when questioned further, he acknowledged that he sometimes opened the safe when Jessica was in the room and may not have always been careful about concealing the combination. This revelation shifted the investigation's focus sharply toward the family's dynamics, with detectives now considering the possibility that the murders had been committed by someone with intimate knowledge of the Hermar household and access to secured areas within it. Following standard procedure in cases involving the deaths of children, detectives obtained a warrant to search the Hermar home, focusing on gathering evidence that might explain how the rifle had been accessed and by whom. In Jessica's bedroom, They found nothing immediately incriminating: no ammunition, no gun cleaning supplies, no obvious souvenirs from the crime that might suggest a trophy-taking mentality. What they did find, however, was a school notebook containing what appeared to be journal entries expressing resentment toward her sisters, with phrases like, "Everyone always likes N and L better," and "Mom and Dad only care about the precious princesses." These writings, while concerning, were not unusual for sibling rivalry and didn't constitute evidence of homicidal intent, but they did provide the first glimpse into Jessica's perception of her place within the family hierarchy. The most significant breakthrough in the initial phase of the investigation came when digital forensics specialist Terrence Wong began examining the family computer located in a shared space in the Hermar home. Following standard operating procedure for cases involving juvenile victims, Wong created a forensic image of the computer's hard drive to preserve all data in its original state before beginning his analysis. When he reviewed the browser history, a disturbing pattern emerged. In the week leading up to the murders, someone had conducted searches for how to load Remington 700 rifle, how much noise does a rifle make indoors, and can a 12-year-old shoot a rifle? The search times coincided with periods when, according to the family's schedule provided to police, Jessica would have been home alone while her sisters were at after-school activities and her parents were still at work. Wong expanded his search of the digital evidence, finding that the user had also researched the layout of Torrey Pines Extension Reserve, focusing on trails and secluded areas, and had visited websites discussing the audible range of gunshots in wooded areas. Most disturbing was a search from 2 days before the murders that asked, "Will people think accident if kids shoot someone?" The computer had automatically logged in under Michael Hermar's user profile, but the timing of the searches and the content specifically related to a child Jessica's age strongly suggested she was the person conducting this research. Wong immediately reported his findings to Detective Anderson, providing the first concrete evidence of premeditation and specific intent that would transform their understanding of the case from a possible accident or a crime of opportunity to a meticulously planned double homicide. As the initial 48 hours of the investigation concluded, the San Diego Police Department had established a timeline of events, collected physical evidence, including the murder weapon, and discovered digital evidence suggesting premeditation. What they still lacked was a clear motive for why a 12-year-old girl would plan and execute the murders of her younger sisters. Initial interviews with teachers, neighbors, and family friends described Jessica as quiet and somewhat withdrawn, but none reported behavior that would predict homicidal violence. The family had no history of involvement with Child Protective Services. Both parents had clean criminal records, and school counselors reported no major behavioral concerns beyond what one called typical middle child adjustment issues. The disconnect between the apparently normal family dynamic and the calculated brutality of the crime created a psychological puzzle that investigators were just beginning to piece together. On the evening of November 1st, with the evidence mounting against Jessica, Detective Anderson made the difficult decision to bring the 12-year-old in for formal questioning. Given her age, both parents were present, along with an attorney Michael Hermar had hastily retained upon realizing the direction the investigation was taking. The interrogation room at San Diego Police Headquarters was modified to appear less intimidating, with comfortable furniture and soft lighting. But nothing could disguise the gravity of the situation as Detective Anderson began to methodically present the evidence they had gathered. Jessica maintained her composure throughout the initial questioning, insisting she had simply left her sisters playing in the park, but her demeanor changed noticeably when Anderson mentioned the computer searches about the rifle. The Digital Forensics Unit's discovery of the incriminating search history marked a pivotal turning point in the investigation, shifting the focus squarely onto Jessica Hermar. digital specialist Terrence Wong had recovered not just the searches about the rifle, but an entire pattern of inquiries that painted a disturbing picture of premeditation. The user had been methodical, Wong explained in his report, first researching the basic operation of the specific rifle model, then progressing to questions about sound, recoil management, and eventually to inquiries about legal consequences. The progression showed a mind moving systematically from conceptualization to planning to consideration of aftermath. Not the impulsive actions of a child acting in momentary anger, but the calculated steps of someone determined to commit murder and potentially avoid consequences. Wong's analysis of the computer usage patterns revealed that these searches had been conducted primarily on weekday afternoons between 3:30 and 5 Juarez p.m., a time when, according to family schedules provided to police, Jessica would typically have been home alone. Nicole and Leslie participated in after-school programs, dance for Nicole, soccer for Leslie, that kept them at school until 5 p.m. 3 days a week, while Sarah Hermer worked as a marketing executive with a commute that brought her home around 5:30 p.m., and Michael Hermer, a software engineer, generally arrived home by 6 p.m. This recurring window of unsupervised time had provided Jessica with the opportunity to research her plan without fear of discovery, using the family computer in the shared home office under her father's automatically logged-in account. The content of the searches became increasingly specific and technical as the date of the murders approached. 2 weeks before the crime, the searches focused on basic information. How does a rifle work? Parts of a Remington 700, and how to load hunting rifle. By the week of the murders, the queries had evolved to include best place to shoot someone to kill instantly, can you muffle a gunshot with blankets, and how far can a gunshot be heard in woods? Most chilling was a search from the day before the murders. Can you tell if child or adult pulled trigger from fingerprints, suggesting Jessica was already considering how she might deflect responsibility if caught. When confronted with this evidence during questioning, Jessica initially claimed someone else must have used the computer, but her explanation faltered when Wong demonstrated that the search times aligned perfectly with her being home alone. The technical specificity of the searches surprised investigators as they revealed a level of deliberation unusual in juvenile offenders. In most cases involving child perpetrators, we see impulsive actions driven by immediate emotions, explained Dr. Elaine Forrester, a forensic psychologist consulting on the case. What makes this case distinct is the extended planning period and the methodical accumulation of information needed to commit the crime effectively. The searches included not just how to operate the weapon, but how to maximize lethality, minimize noise, and avoid detection, considerations that showed an understanding of both the practical aspects of committing murder and the investigative techniques that might follow. This level of calculation raised serious questions about Jessica's psychological development and her capacity for moral reasoning. Beyond the computer searches, detectives began assembling other evidence that pointed to Jessica's emerging status as the prime suspect. A review of her school assignments revealed a creative writing piece submitted 3 weeks before the murders in which the protagonist, a girl described as always in the shadow of her perfect siblings, discovered a magical object that could make people disappear. Her English teacher, initially concerned by the dark tone of the story, had discussed it with Jessica, who assured her it was just fiction inspired by fantasy books, an explanation the teacher had accepted as reasonable for a middle schooler with an active imagination. In retrospect, however, the story contained elements that paralleled Jessica's apparent feelings about her sisters and hinted at her developing plan to eliminate them from her life. Jessica's social media presence, limited by her parents to age-appropriate platforms with privacy controls, provided additional insights into her mindset leading up to the murders. Her posts, which had once featured occasional photos with her sisters at family events, had gradually shifted over the previous 6 months to exclude Nicole and Leslie entirely. Her most recent posts focused exclusively on herself, often with captions expressing sentiments like, "Finally doing things my way," and "Some people don't deserve what they have." While these posts weren't explicitly threatening, forensic psychologists noted that the progression from inclusion to exclusion of her sisters, coupled with the increasing emphasis on personal autonomy, aligned with patterns seen in adolescents experiencing pathological jealousy and developing rationalization structures for harmful actions. Interviews with school personnel began to construct a more complex picture of Jessica than the quiet, unremarkable student her parents and neighbors had described. Her 7th-grade math teacher recalled an incident 2 months before the murders when Jessica had become disproportionately angry after receiving a B+ on a test, saying, "Nicole always gets A's without even trying, and everyone makes such a big deal about it." The school counselor reported that Jessica had been referred to her after a playground altercation where she had pushed a classmate who had praised Leslie's performance at a recent swim meet, telling the girl, "No one cares about stupid swimming." These isolated incidents had been addressed as normal adolescent adjustment issues rather than warning signs of dangerous resentment, as they hadn't seemed to indicate potential for violence when viewed individually. Detective Anderson, reviewing all the accumulating evidence, recognized the need to establish a clearer picture of the family dynamics that might have contributed to Jessica's apparent resentment of her sisters. Interviews with extended family members revealed patterns that hadn't been immediately apparent. Jessica's maternal grandmother, Evelyn Martinez, described how, at family gatherings, Nicole and Leslie were often praised for their accomplishments and sociability, while Jessica, more introverted and less demonstrative, received less attention. Michael and Sarah didn't mean to create any imbalance, Martinez explained, but Nicole and Leslie were more outgoing, more visibly talented in ways that drew attention. Jessica was quieter, harder to read. This pattern of differential social reinforcement, while not unusual in families with multiple children, appeared to have had a profound impact on Jessica's self-perception and her view of her place within the family. The investigation took a significant turn when detectives interviewed Jessica's former babysitter, 20-year-old Olivia Fan, who had regularly cared for the Hermar children before leaving for college the previous year. Fan described incidents that, in hindsight, suggested Jessica's resentment toward her sisters had been developing for some time, Jessica removing Nicole's artwork from the refrigerator and hiding it, deliberately breaking a trophy Leslie had received for swimming, and once telling Fan, "Everyone would be happier if it was just me." Fan had mentioned these behaviors to Sarah Hermar, who had arranged for Jessica to begin seeing a therapist for what was described as adjustment to changes at home, referring to the increasing independence and achievements of her younger sisters. The therapy, however, had been discontinued after 3 months when Jessica refused to participate, telling her parents the therapist was stupid and doesn't understand anything. As the evidence mounted, Detective Anderson scheduled a formal interview with Jessica's therapist, Dr. Rachel Goldman, who initially expressed reluctance to discuss a minor patient, but cooperated after being served with a court order related to the homicide investigation. Dr. Goldman revealed that during their sessions, Jessica had expressed feelings of being invisible in her own home, describing how her parents attended every one of Nicole's art shows and Leslie's swim meets, but had missed Jessica's science fair because it conflicted with Leslie's soccer tournament. She told me they wouldn't notice if I disappeared, but they'd notice if precious Nicole or Leslie even got a paper cut, Goldman recalled. These therapy sessions had concluded 6 months before the murders, when Jessica had simply stopped engaging, responding to questions with one-word answers, until her parents decided to discontinue the treatment. The most damning evidence emerged when detectives obtained Jessica's personal journal through a supplemental search warrant, finding entries that explicitly detailed her growing hatred for her sisters and her desire to eliminate them from her life. An entry dated 2 months before the murders read, "I watched Dad teaching N and L how to use his telescope tonight. He never shows me anything cool like that. I asked if I could look too, and he said, 'In a minute.' But that minute never came because Precious L saw Saturn's rings, and everyone was so amazed. Sometimes I think about if they just weren't here anymore, and it was just me. Mom and Dad would have to pay attention to me then." The journal contained no explicit murder plan, but the progression of entries showed Jessica's fantasy of being an only child evolving from a vague wish to a fixation she revisited repeatedly. With the journal entries corroborating the digital evidence, physical evidence from the crime scene, and witness statements about Jessica's history of resentment toward her sisters, Detective Anderson believed they had established sufficient probable cause to treat the 12-year-old as the prime suspect in her sister's murders. The decision to pursue charges against a child so young was not taken lightly, involving consultations with the district attorney's office, juvenile justice specialists, and forensic psychologists to assess both the strength of the evidence and Jessica's capacity to understand the nature and consequences of her actions. The legal standard for charging a juvenile as young as 12 with murder required not only evidence of the act itself, but also demonstration of the child's ability to form specific intent and understand the permanence and wrongfulness of causing death. On the morning of November 3rd, 4 days after the murders, Detective Anderson and a female officer from the Juvenile Division arrived at the Hermar home with a warrant for Jessica's arrest. Michael and Sarah Hermar, who had been staying with relatives since the discovery of their daughters' bodies, were notified of the impending arrest and arrived at the house just as the officers were explaining the situation to Jessica. The scene that unfolded in the living room of the once happy family home represented the complete shattering of what remained of the Hermar family. Parents forced to witness their only surviving child being taken into custody for the murders of their other children. Sarah Hermar attempted to embrace Jessica before she was led away, but the girl turned from her mother's outstretched arms, saying only, "You'll visit me, right?" A question that hung in the air as the officers escorted her to the waiting police vehicle. As news of Jessica's arrest spread through the community and eventually gained national attention, public reaction ranged from shock and disbelief to grim fascination with the case of the San Diego sister killer, as some media outlets had begun to call her. Legal experts appeared on television debating whether a 12-year-old could or should be held fully accountable for such a calculated crime, while psychologists discussed the potential factors that might lead a child to develop such deadly jealousy toward her siblings. At the center of this storm of public opinion and professional analysis, Jessica Hermar was processed into the San Diego County Juvenile Detention Facility, where she would await a fitness hearing to determine whether she would be tried as a juvenile or, in an exceptional legal move, as an adult for the premeditated murders of Nicole and Leslie Hermar. The task of building a comprehensive case against 12-year-old Jessica Hermar fell primarily to Assistant District Attorney Emma Baker, a veteran prosecutor with the San Diego County District Attorney's Office, who specialized in cases involving juvenile offenders and violent crimes. Baker assembled a team that included forensic experts, digital analysts, psychologists, and investigators to examine every aspect of the evidence against Jessica, knowing that prosecuting a child this young for premeditated murder would face intense scrutiny from both the legal community and the public. "We need this case to be airtight," Baker told her team during their first strategy meeting. Not just because of the defendant's age, but because these victims deserve nothing less than absolute justice. The foundation of that case would be the computer search history that had first revealed Jessica's methodical planning. Digital forensic specialist Terrence Wong expanded his analysis of the family computer, recovering not only the browser history that showed Jessica's research into rifles and shooting, but also deleted files that further incriminated her. Using specialized recovery software, Wong discovered that Jessica had downloaded and later deleted a PDF manual for her father's Remington 700 rifle, saving it temporarily to a folder she had created called School Project, an apparent attempt to disguise the true nature of her research. The metadata showed the manual had been accessed multiple times in the weeks before the murders, with the most recent access occurring the day before the crime. Wong also recovered deleted search queries that showed Jessica had researched topics like, "Do kids go to real jail for murder?" and "What is the youngest age someone has killed?" The physical evidence connecting Jessica to the crime continued to mount as the forensic analysis of items from the scene was completed. The rifle found in the duffel bag contained fingerprints that matched Jessica's on the barrel, stock, and trigger, positioned in a way consistent with someone firing the weapon rather than merely handling it. While Michael Hermar's prints were also present on parts of the rifle, the positioning was consistent with his explanation of having last used the weapon for cleaning several months earlier. Most damning was the gunshot residue analysis, which detected particles on the sleeve of a jacket recovered from Jessica's bedroom closet, a light windbreaker similar to one she had been seen wearing in a family photo taken at the park several weeks earlier. Ballistics expert Dr. Raymond Chen confirmed that the bullets recovered from the victims' bodies matched test rounds fired from Michael Hermar's rifle, establishing it definitively as the murder weapon. His analysis also provided crucial information about the shooter's level of control and intent. The shot placement indicates someone who took time to aim carefully, Chen explained in his report. The head wounds in particular show precision that suggests a shooter who was either naturally steady-handed or who had practiced maintaining control of the weapon. This assessment aligned with Jessica's search history, which included queries about managing a rifle's recoil and improving aim accuracy, suggesting she had researched how to ensure her shots would be lethal. The autopsy reports for Nicole and Leslie, completed by San Diego County Medical Examiner Dr. Victoria Nguyen, provided additional insights into the sequence and nature of the murders. Dr. Nguyen determined that Leslie had been killed instantly by a single shot to the back of the head, fired from approximately 5 feet away, based on powder stippling patterns around the wound. Nicole had first been shot in the chest, a wound that would have been painful and debilitating but not immediately fatal, followed by a second shot to the head after she had fallen to the ground and apparently tried to crawl away, as evidenced by disturbed leaf litter and blood smears on the forest floor. The evidence suggests the second victim witnessed the first shooting, attempted to escape, and was pursued by the shooter, Dr. Nguyen stated, a scenario that painted a horrific picture of Nicole's final ass moments and suggested a level of determination in the killer to complete the act despite seeing her sister's suffering. As the forensic evidence solidified the physical case against Jessica, prosecutors worked to establish the psychological elements that would explain her motive and demonstrate her capacity to understand the nature of her actions. Dr. Elaine Forrester, the forensic psychologist assigned to the case, conducted an extensive review of Jessica's school records, therapy notes, journal entries, and social media activity, identifying a pattern of escalating jealousy and resentment toward her sisters. "What we're seeing here isn't typical sibling rivalry," Dr. Forrester explained to the prosecution team. "Jessica's writings show what we call pathological jealousy, an intense, irrational belief that her sisters were stealing something that was rightfully hers, specifically her parents' love and attention." Dr. Forrester's analysis revealed that Jessica's perception of being overlooked had become increasingly distorted over time, transforming normal parental behavior into perceived slights that reinforced her sense of being unloved. In one journal entry from 3 months before the murders, Jessica had written, "Mom spent 2 hours helping Nicole with her stupid art project tonight. When I asked for help with my math homework, she said she was tired and I should figure it out myself. She's never tired when precious Nicole needs something." Forrester noted that this type of selective attention to perceived inequities, while ignoring instances of receiving care and attention herself, was characteristic of individuals developing dangerous fixations. She was creating a narrative in which she was consistently victimized by her sister's very existence, Forrester explained, and eventually she concluded that their elimination was the only solution. Interviews with the Hermars' neighbors, the girls' teachers, and family friends revealed subtle warning signs that had gone unrecognized before the tragedy. Jessica's swim instructor recalled an incident 6 months earlier when Jessica had refused to participate in a pool game because Leslie was showing off by demonstrating strokes Jessica hadn't yet mastered, eventually pushing Leslie underwater in what had been dismissed as roughhousing, but in retrospect appeared more sinister. A neighbor reported seeing Jessica standing alone in the family's backyard, staring intently through the window at a family dinner where Nicole was being congratulated for winning an art contest, her expression described as cold and calculating, in a way that seemed unnatural for a child that age. These isolated observations, unremarkable when viewed separately, formed a disturbing pattern when assembled as part of the larger investigation. The case took an unexpected turn when prosecutors discovered that Jessica had attempted to create an alibi for herself in the days leading up to the murders. 2 of her classmates reported that Jessica had invited them to come over to her house on the afternoon of October 30th, the day of the murders, to work on a science project together. Both girls had declined due to prior commitments, but the invitation, extended just 2 days before the crime, suggested Jessica had been thinking about how to account for her whereabouts. It's unusually sophisticated for someone her age to think about establishing an alibi, noted Detective Anderson. Most juvenile offenders act impulsively without considering how to cover their tracks. This deliberate attempt to create witnesses who could place her away from the crime scene further demonstrated the premeditated nature of Jessica's plan. As Baker prepared the prosecution's case, she recognized that one of the most challenging aspects would be establishing Jessica's capacity to understand the permanence of death and the moral wrongfulness of her actions, key elements in determining criminal responsibility for a child so young. To address this, she arranged for Dr. Martin Goldstein, a leading expert in child cognitive development, to evaluate Jessica and review the evidence of her planning and research. After his assessment, Dr. Goldstein concluded, based on the methodical nature of her preparation, her attempts to conceal evidence, her research into legal consequences, and her creation of cover stories, Jessica demonstrated a clear understanding that killing her sisters was not only physically permanent, but morally wrong and legally punishable. These are not the actions of a child who fails to grasp the concept of death or the distinction between right and wrong. The investigation into the family dynamics that had contributed to Jessica's extreme jealousy revealed a household that was, by most external measures, loving and supportive, but in which subtle imbalances had been magnified through the lens of a troubled child's perception. Interviews with extended family members, family friends, and the Hermars themselves painted a picture of parents who genuinely tried to meet the needs of all 3 daughters, but who may have unintentionally created a situation where Jessica felt overshadowed by her more outgoing, visibly talented younger sisters. School counseling records indicated that Michael and Sarah had sought help for Jessica's adjustment issues, but had not recognized the depth of her resentment or her capacity for violence, an oversight that now haunted them as they faced the loss of 2 daughters and the criminal prosecution of the third. By mid-November, 2 weeks after the murders, Assistant District Attorney Baker felt the prosecution had built a sufficiently strong case to proceed with formal charges. The evidence connecting Jessica to the crime was substantial. Her fingerprints on the murder weapon, gunshot residue on her clothing, her digital search history showing methodical planning, her journal entries revealing motive, and witness statements describing her history of jealousy and resentment toward her sisters. What remained uncertain was whether Jessica would be tried as a new Maruvenile or as an adult, a decision that would determine not only the nature of the legal proceedings, but the potential consequences she would face if convicted. Baker filed a motion requesting a fitness hearing, where the court would determine whether the juvenile justice system could adequately address a crime of this magnitude, or whether Jessica should be transferred to adult court despite her young age. The case against Jessica Hermar had now progressed from initial suspicion to a comprehensive body of evidence supporting charges of first-degree murder with special circumstances, multiple victims, and lying in wait. As the prosecution prepared for the upcoming fitness hearing and potential trial, the defense team, led by prominent juvenile rights attorney Rebecca Sandoval, began developing counter-arguments focused on Jessica's age, psychological development, and the potential influence of undiagnosed mental health issues. The stage was set for a legal battle that would not only determine Jessica's fate, but potentially establish precedents for how the justice system handles cases involving extreme violence committed by very young offenders. The formal arrest of Jessica Hermar took place on November 3, 2024, at 9:15 a.m., when Detective Noah Anderson and Juvenile Division Officer Lisa Chen arrived at the temporary residence where the Hermar family was staying following the murders. Due to Jessica's age and the sensitive nature of the case, the officers had arranged the arrest to minimize trauma and public exposure, allowing Michael and Sarah Hermar to be present and giving them time to contact their attorney. Officer Chen, specially trained in handling juvenile suspects, explained the process to Jessica in age-appropriate language, while Detective Anderson informed the parents of their rights and the immediate next steps. Jessica, dressed in jeans and a gray sweatshirt, showed little emotion as Officer Chen read her Miranda rights, responding with a quiet, "I understand," after each statement, a level of composure that both officers later described in their reports as unsettling for a 12-year-old in such circumstances. The transportation of Jessica to the San Diego Juvenile Detention Facility was handled with careful attention to both security and her status as a minor. She was not handcuffed, in accordance with department policy for juvenile suspects, but was seated in the rear of an unmarked police vehicle with Officer Chen beside her. During the 20-minute drive, Chen reported that Jessica remained silent, staring out the window at the familiar San Diego landscapes passing by, only speaking once to ask, "Will I have my own room there?" At the detention facility, she was processed according to juvenile protocols, which included a medical examination, psychological screening, and placement in a secure observation unit where staff could monitor her for signs of distress or self-harm, standard procedure for juveniles accused of violent crimes. Jessica's initial court appearance took place the following morning, a closed proceeding attended only by her parents, her defense attorney Rebecca Sandoval, prosecutor Emma Baker, and necessary court personnel. Judge Marcus Washington, a veteran of the juvenile court with over 15 years of experience, conducted the hearing, which served primarily to formally notify Jessica of the charges against her, 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, and to schedule the fitness hearing that would determine whether her case would remain in juvenile court or be transferred to adult criminal court. Throughout the proceedings, court observers noted that Jessica sat perfectly still, her expression blank, showing no visible reaction even when the charges were read, a demeanor that juvenile probation officer Denise Morton described in her report as concerning in its absence of appropriate emotional response. Following the initial court appearance, Jessica was returned to the detention facility where she would remain through the pre-trial proceedings. The San Diego County Juvenile Detention Facility, while designed with the needs of minor offenders in mind, had rarely housed a child as young as Jessica accused of such serious crimes. Facility Director Raymond Torres implemented a specialized supervision plan that balanced security concerns with recognition of her developmental needs, assigning experienced staff to her unit and arranging for continued education services. Jessica was initially kept separate from the general population of detained juveniles, both for her own safety, given the high-profile nature of her case, and due to concerns about her potential impact on other detained youth who were struggling to process the nature of her alleged crimes. The formal interrogation of Jessica took place on November 5th, conducted by Detective Anderson with the presence of her defense attorney and a licensed child psychologist appointed by the court to ensure appropriate questioning techniques were used. The session was held in a specially designed room at the detention facility, equipped with comfortable furniture and recording equipment that would document every aspect of the interview. Jessica's parents, though legally permitted to attend, had been advised by their attorney to remain outside the interrogation room to prevent their reactions from potentially influencing their daughter's responses. As the recording equipment was activated and preliminary identifications were stated for the record, Jessica sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight, her expression revealing nothing of her internal state. Detective Anderson began the interrogation with non-threatening questions about Jessica's daily life, school, and interests, a technique designed to establish rapport and ease the subject into more substantive questioning. Jessica responded with brief, factual answers, showing no interest in the conversational openings Anderson offered, her affect flat, and her eye contact minimal. When the detective gradually shifted the focus to the day of the murders, asking Jessica to describe what had happened in her own words, she repeated the same account she had given initially. She had taken her sisters to the park to build a fort, become bored with their childish behavior, and left them playing there to return home alone. Her narrative remained consistent with her previous statements, but lacked emotional content or sensory details typically present in truthful recollections of significant events. The turning point in the interrogation came when Anderson placed a folder on the table between them and began methodically presenting the evidence that contradicted Jessica's account. He first showed her photographs of the crime scene, including the location of the bodies in relation to the main trail, pointing out that the clearing was far too remote for her to have plausibly left her sisters playing there casually. "This location is over 100 yards from any marked trail, Jessica," Anderson said, his tone remaining neutral and non-accusatory. "It would take deliberate effort to find this spot. Can you explain why you would leave your 9- and 10-year-old sisters so far from where someone could find them?" Jessica's response, "They wanted to go there, not me," maintained her denial, but her voice had lost some of its confidence, and the child psychologist noted in her report that Jessica's breathing had become more rapid. Anderson continued by presenting printed screenshots of the computer searches that had been recovered from the family computer, laying them out one by one in chronological order to demonstrate the progression from general research about rifles to specific queries about shooting people and concealing evidence. "These searches were all made when you were home alone, Jessica," Anderson explained. "We've checked the family schedules, the school attendance records, and your parents' work logs. No one else was in the house when these searches were conducted. For the first time in the interrogation, Jessica showed visible discomfort, shifting in her chair and glancing toward her attorney, who reminded her of her right to remain silent. After a moment's hesitation, Jessica said only, "Anyone could use that computer. It doesn't mean it was me." The detective then produced the most compelling physical evidence, photographs of the fingerprint analysis from the rifle, highlighting where Jessica's prints had been found on the trigger, barrel, and stock in positions consistent with firing the weapon. "These aren't just handling prints, Jessica," Anderson explained. "These show your fingers were positioned exactly as they would be if you were shooting the rifle." As he laid out additional evidence, the gunshot residue on her jacket, the journal entries expressing jealousy toward her sisters, the statements from witnesses describing her resentment, Jessica's composed facade began to crack. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, a self-protective gesture noted by the psychologist, and her eyes darted around the room as if seeking an escape from the mounting evidence. When Anderson presented the final piece of evidence, a printout of Jessica's search query, "Will people think accident if kids shoot someone?" the tension in the room became palpable. Jessica stared at the paper for several long moments before looking up at the detective, her expression changing from neutral to challenging. "So what if I looked that up?" she asked, her voice taking on an edge that hadn't been present before. Looking something up isn't a crime. It was this shift in demeanor that Anderson had been carefully working toward, recognizing that Jessica's defense mechanisms were starting to falter under the weight of the evidence. Rather than pressing his advantage aggressively, however, he changed tactics, softening his tone and asking, "Jessica, can you help me understand why? What was happening that made you feel this was necessary?" The question about motive created a visible reaction in Jessica, her eyes widening slightly before she controlled her expression. She remained silent for nearly a full minute, long enough that her attorney began to intervene, but Jessica finally spoke in a voice that had lost its defensive edge and now sounded younger, more vulnerable than at any previous point in the interrogation. "No one ever sees me," she said, almost too quietly to be captured by the recording equipment. "They only see Nicole and Leslie." When Anderson gently prompted her to elaborate, the floodgates opened, and Jessica began to articulate the jealousy that had consumed her. How Nicole's artwork covered the refrigerator while her school achievements went unremarked. How her parents attended every one of Leslie's swim meets but had missed her science fair presentation. How family conversations revolved around her sister's activities while her contributions were acknowledged with distracted nods. As Jessica continued to speak, her emotional control deteriorated further, her voice rising and her gestures becoming more animated. "No matter what I did, they were always the special ones, the perfect ones, the ones everyone loved," she exclaimed, tears finally appearing in her eyes. Not tears of remorse, the psychologist would later note in her assessment, but tears of self-pity and perceived injustice. "I just wanted Mom and Dad to see me for once. I wanted to be the only one, the special one." When Anderson asked directly if she had taken her sisters to the woods intending to kill them, Jessica's response sent a chill through everyone in the room. "I wanted to see if they were still the favorites when they were gone." This statement, delivered with a calm clarity that contrasted sharply with her emotional outburst moments before, would later become central to the prosecution's argument about Jessica's capacity to form specific intent. The interrogation continued for another hour, with Jessica providing increasingly detailed information about how she had planned and executed the murders. She described taking the key to her father's gun safe from his dresser drawer when he was showering, practicing opening the safe when her parents were out, and testing the weight of the rifle to ensure she could handle it. She recounted leading her sisters to the remote clearing, telling them it was the perfect spot for their fort because no one would find it, and instructing them to gather branches while she got something from the bag. She described the moment of decision with a detachment that disturbed even the experienced detective. I just pointed it at Leslie first because she was facing away, and I thought it would be easier. Nicole tried to run after that, but she didn't get very far. Throughout Jessica's confession, the court-appointed psychologist observed and documented her emotional presentation, later reporting that Jessica showed significant deficits in empathy and remorse, and displayed what appeared to be genuine confusion when asked how her sisters might have felt in their final moments. When Anderson asked if she understood that her actions had permanently ended her sisters' lives, that Nicole and Leslie would never grow up, never have their own experiences, never see their parents again, Jessica's response revealed the depth of her disturbance. That was the whole point. Now, I get to be the daughter. This statement, more than any other made during the interrogation, would later influence the court's decision regarding Jessica's understanding of the permanence of death and the moral wrongfulness of her actions. As the interrogation concluded, Jessica was provided with water and a brief break before being returned to her secure room in the detention facility. Detective Anderson met with the prosecution team to discuss the interview results, providing both the recorded evidence and his professional assessment of Jessica's statements and demeanor. She understood exactly what she was doing, Anderson told Assistant District Attorney Baker. This wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a moment of rage or confusion. She researched it, planned it, executed it, and tried to cover it up. And when confronted with the evidence, she wasn't remorseful. She was almost proud of her planning, as if we should be impressed by how thorough she'd been. This evaluation, coming from a detective with nearly 2 decades of experience interviewing violent offenders, carried significant weight as the prosecution prepared for the fitness hearing that would determine whether Jessica would be tried as a juvenile or an adult. The days following Jessica's confession saw increased security measures at the detention facility after she made concerning statements to staff members. A female guard reported that Jessica had asked detailed questions about the facility's layout, visitor protocols, and supervision rotations, inquiries that seemed oriented toward identifying potential vulnerabilities in the security system. Another staff member overheard Jessica telling a maintenance worker that it's too bad they took away all the sharp things in here, a comment that, while not an explicit threat, raised concerns about her intentions. Facility Director Torres implemented a modified supervision protocol that included constant monitoring and restricted Jessica's access to items that could potentially be weaponized, measures typically reserved for detainees who posed specific security risks rather than standard procedure for juvenile offenders. The psychological evaluation conducted in the wake of Jessica's confession focused heavily on her capacity for empathy and her understanding of moral boundaries. Dr. Gabriela Martinez, the forensic psychologist assigned to perform the comprehensive assessment, administered a battery of standardized tests and conducted extensive clinical interviews with Jessica over a 2-week period. Her findings, submitted to both the prosecution and defense teams, described a child who scored significantly below age-appropriate norms on measures of empathy and perspective-taking, and who demonstrates a pattern of moral reasoning that prioritizes personal benefit over harm to others. While stopping short of diagnosing a specific personality disorder, given Jessica's young age, Dr. Martinez noted patterns consistent with the developmental precursors to antisocial personality traits, including a profound lack of remorse, limited emotional range, and a transactional view of human relationships. As the date for the fitness hearing approached, public interest in the case intensified, with legal experts, child psychologists, and victim advocates weighing in through media outlets on the complex questions raised by the prosecution of a 12-year-old for premeditated murder. Outside the juvenile court building, protesters gathered with competing messages, some arguing that Jessica's young age should preclude adult prosecution regardless of the crime's severity, others insisting that the premeditated murder of 2 children demanded the most serious consequences available under law. Through it all, Jessica remained in detention, reportedly asking her guards for more books to read and inquiring about when she could return to school, questions that reflected either a failure to grasp the gravity of her situation or a disturbing ability to compartmentalize the reality of what she had done and what now lay ahead. The San Diego County Superior Court Juvenile Division was transformed in the weeks leading up to Jessica Hermar's trial, with enhanced security measures, procedural modifications to accommodate the unprecedented nature of the case, and preparations for the intense media attention that would surround the proceedings. Although juvenile court hearings are typically closed to the public to protect the privacy of minors, Judge Eleanor Ramirez made the exceptional decision to allow limited media access to the trial, citing the profound public interest in the case and the need for transparency in the judicial process. This decision came after the fitness hearing held in late November had determined that Jessica would be tried as an adult despite her age, a ruling that had already sparked national debate about juvenile justice, mental competency, and appropriate punishment for extremely young offenders who commit heinous crimes. The fitness hearing that preceded the trial had been a critical legal battle, with Assistant District Attorney Emma Baker arguing that the nature of Jessica's crimes, premeditated, calculated, and showing extreme depravity, warranted adult prosecution. This was not impulsive behavior or a momentary lapse in judgment, Baker had told the court during her closing argument. Jessica Hermar researched how to kill her sisters, practiced with the murder weapon, selected a remote location to ensure no interference, and took deliberate steps to avoid detection. She understood exactly what she was doing and what the consequences would be for her victims. Defense attorney Rebecca Sandoval had countered that no child of 12, regardless of the crime's severity, could possess the neurological development and moral reasoning capacity to be held accountable as an adult, presenting expert testimony about adolescent brain development and arguing that the juvenile system's rehabilitative focus was more appropriate for a defendant of Jessica's age. Judge Ramirez's decision to allow Jessica to be tried as an adult had hinged on 5 specific factors: the degree of criminal sophistication exhibited, whether Jessica could be rehabilitated within the time frame of juvenile court jurisdiction, her previous delinquent history, the success of previous attempts at rehabilitation, and the circumstances and gravity of the offense. In her 20-page ruling, Ramirez had written, "While the court acknowledges the defendant's young age and the scientific evidence regarding adolescent brain development, it cannot ignore the extraordinary level of premeditation, the calculated efforts to avoid detection, and the complete lack of remorse displayed. The evidence strongly suggests that Jessica Hermar understood the nature and consequences of her actions, planned them with precision unusual for her age, and executed them with a clarity of purpose that demonstrates criminal sophistication beyond what might be expected of a typical 12-year-old. The trial began on February 10, 2025, with jury selection, a process complicated by the extensive media coverage the case had already received and the emotional reactions many prospective jurors had to the idea of a child killing her. Siblings. Over 2 weeks, the court screened hundreds of potential jurors, with both prosecution and defense teams using their challenges to eliminate those who expressed strong preconceived opinions about Jessica's guilt or inability to form criminal intent. The final panel consisted of 8 women and 4 men from diverse backgrounds, including a high school teacher, a pediatric nurse, a retired military officer, a software engineer, and a social worker, a composition that both legal teams believed would bring varied perspectives to the difficult questions of criminal responsibility, psychological development, and appropriate justice for a 12-year-old defendant. On February 24th, the trial officially opened with Judge Ramirez instructing the jury on their responsibilities and the unique circumstances of the case, emphasizing that while Jessica was being tried as an adult, they must carefully consider her age as a factor in their deliberations about her mental state and understanding of her actions. The courtroom had been arranged to accommodate Jessica's height. Her chair was adjusted so that she could see and be seen above the defense table, a modification that inadvertently highlighted her youth and small stature. Dressed in a conservative navy blue dress with a white collar, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, Jessica presented a striking contrast to the gravity of the charges against her, a visual dichotomy that was not lost on the jurors, several of whom were observed glancing repeatedly between the child defendant and the crime scene photos displayed during opening statements. Assistant District Attorney Emma Baker's opening statement laid out the prosecution's case with methodical precision, projecting a timeline on a large screen that showed the progression of Jessica's computer searches alongside family events in the weeks leading up to the murders. What you will see throughout this trial, Baker told the jury, is not the impulsive action of an immature mind, but the calculated execution of a plan designed to eliminate what Jessica Hermer had come to view as the obstacle to her happiness, her sisters, Nicole and Leslie. Baker then played a brief video compilation of home movies showing the Hermer sisters in happier times, Nicole painting at an easel, Leslie performing a dance routine, the girls laughing together on a backyard swing set, juxtaposed against crime scene photos that showed their bodies in the wooded ravine, a stark visual representation of what had been lost. Defense attorney Rebecca Sandoval's opening argument focused heavily on Jessica's psychological development and family dynamics, projecting brain scan images that showed the immature prefrontal cortex of adolescents compared to adults, while explaining how this affects impulse control, consequence evaluation, and emotional regulation. Jessica Hermar's brain, like that of any 12-year-old, was and is fundamentally unfinished, Sandoval told the jury. The very part of the brain responsible for understanding long-term consequences, controlling impulsive behavior, and properly processing emotional stimuli was still years away from full development. Sandoval then outlined what she described as a perfect storm of environmental factors, perceived parental favoritism, academic pressure, social isolation, and untreated psychological issues that had created the conditions for tragedy. The prosecution's case began with testimony from Detective Noah Anderson, who walked the jury through the HPDL missing persons report, the discovery of the bodies, and the evidence that had led investigators to focus on Jessica as a suspect. Anderson's testimony was professional and factual, but the details he provided, the positioning of the victims' bodies, the blood evidence showing Nicole had crawled several feet after being shot in the chest, the attempts to conceal both the bodies and the weapon, painted a disturbing picture that visibly affected several jurors. During cross-examination, Sandoval pressed Anderson on whether the investigation had adequately considered other potential suspects, suggesting that the focus on Jessica had been premature, but Anderson methodically explained how each piece of evidence had narrowed the investigation until Jessica was the only plausible suspect. Michael and Sarah Hermar took the stand on the third day of the trial, their testimony requiring frequent recesses, as both parents struggled with overwhelming emotion when describing their daughters and the events surrounding their deaths. Michael Hermar, looking significantly aged since his daughter's murders, described his rifle and the security measures he had taken with it, including the combination locked safe and his practice of keeping ammunition stored separately. When asked if he had ever shown Jessica how to operate the weapon, he responded with visible distress. "Never. I took the girls target shooting once, but only with a small caliber rifle, and I was right there the whole time. I never showed any of them how to load or operate my hunting rifle." Sarah Hermar's testimony focused on the family dynamics, acknowledging that while they had tried to give each daughter individual attention and support, Jessica had become increasingly withdrawn over the previous year, refusing family activities and reacting with apparent indifference to both discipline and positive reinforcement. Digital forensics specialist Terrence Wong provided what many legal observers considered the most damaging testimony against Jessica, methodically presenting the progression of her computer searches in the weeks before the murders. Wong showed the jury how Jessica had begun with basic searches about rifle operation, then moved to increasingly specific queries about shooting accuracy, sound suppression, and the legal consequences for juvenile offenders. Using specialized software to display the timeline of searches alongside the family's documented schedules, Wong demonstrated that these searches had occurred exclusively during times when Jessica was home alone, establishing that no other family member could have conducted this research. During cross-examination, Sandoval questioned the reliability of digital time stamping and suggested the possibility of remote access to the computer. But Wong's methodical explanations of the technical safeguards in his analysis effectively countered these alternative theories. Ballistics expert Dr. Raymond Chen testified about the murder weapon, explaining to the jury how the rifle functioned and demonstrating, with a disabled similar model, the strength and knowledge required to operate it effectively. "This is not a weapon that could be fired accurately by accident or without basic understanding of its mechanics," Chen explained, showing how the bolt action needed to be manually operated between shots. "The fact that we have precision shots to the head on both victims indicates someone who knew how to aim, how to control breathing to minimize movement, and how to operate the bolt to chamber a new round, all skills that would require either instruction or research to acquire." This testimony directly connected Jessica's computer searches to the physical evidence at the crime scene, strengthening the prosecution's argument about premeditation and intent. The first week of the trial concluded with testimony from the San Diego medical examiner, Dr. Victoria Nguyen, who presented the autopsy findings for Nicole and Leslie Hermar. Using anatomical diagrams rather than the actual autopsy photos out of consideration for the jury and the victim's parents, Dr. Nguyen explained the bullet trajectories, the cause of death for each child, and the evidence suggesting Nicole had remained conscious and mobile after the initial chest wound, attempting to escape before receiving the fatal headshot. The blood trail and pattern of disturbed ground cover indicate that Nicole was conscious for approximately 15 to 30 seconds after the first shot, moving away from the shooter before the second shot was fired, Dr. Nguyen testified, information that established not only the sequence of events, but suggested the killer had pursued Nicole to complete the attack, a detail that spoke directly to intent rather than panic or accident. As the prosecution continued building its case during the second week of trial, the courtroom dynamics remained tense but controlled, with Judge Ramirez maintaining strict decorum despite the emotionally charged testimony. Jessica sat beside her attorneys each day, her expression generally impassive, regardless of the evidence being presented, though court observers noted she appeared most engaged during technical testimony about the rifle and ballistics, at one point passing a note to her attorney during Dr. Chen's explanation of the weapon's mechanics. This apparent interest in the technical aspects of the crime, rather than its human impact, became a subtle but persistent theme that prosecutors would later reference in their closing arguments, suggesting it revealed Jessica's priorities and perspective even during her own trial for murder. The prosecution's case reached a critical juncture with the testimony of Dr. Elaine Forrester, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated Jessica and analyzed her writings, statements, and behavior before and after the murders. Dr. Forrester, a nationally recognized expert in juvenile violence with over 20 years of experience, took the stand wearing a conservative charcoal suit, her gray hair pulled back in a bun, presenting a figure of academic authority as she was sworn in. Assistant District Attorney Emma Baker established Forrester's extensive credentials before guiding her through testimony that would address the central question in many jurors' minds: how could a 12-year-old develop and act on such lethal jealousy toward her own sisters? What we see in Jessica's case is what we term pathological jealousy, a condition that goes far beyond normal sibling rivalry, Dr. Forrester explained, referencing slides showing excerpts from Jessica's journal alongside academic definitions of the condition. In typical sibling relationships, children may compete for parental attention or resources, but they generally maintain fundamental attachment to their siblings and recognize them as permanent, valued family members. Pathological jealousy, by contrast, involves a distorted perception where the individual views the target of their jealousy as an existential threat who must be eliminated to ensure their own well-being. Forrester described how Jessica's writings showed a progressive dehumanization of her sisters, referring to them first by name, then as the princesses, and eventually as simply the problems. A linguistic shift that reflected her increasingly distorted perception of Nicole and Leslie as obstacles rather than people. Defense attorney Rebecca Sandoval's cross-examination of Dr. Forrester focused on challenging the distinction between pathological jealousy and normal developmental struggles with sibling relationships. Isn't it true, Doctor, that many children experience intense jealousy of siblings without it indicating psychological pathology? Sandoval asked, displaying statements from child development textbooks about the prevalence of sibling conflict. Forrester acknowledged that sibling jealousy itself was common, but maintained that the progression and intensity of Jessica's feelings, combined with her methodical planning and lack of remorse, distinguished her case from typical developmental patterns. What separates normal jealousy from pathology is not just the feeling itself, but how the individual processes and acts on that feeling, Forrester explained. Jessica didn't just wish her sisters would get less attention. She concluded that their permanent removal was the only acceptable solution, and she acted on that belief with careful planning rather than impulsive aggression. The prosecution called Jessica's former therapist, Dr. Rachel Goldman, who testified about the 6 months of treatment she had provided before Jessica had withdrawn from therapy. Goldman described how Jessica had initially presented with what appeared to be adjustment issues related to her social development and family relationships, concerns common enough for an early adolescent. At first, Jessica seemed like many 12-year-olds struggling with identity formation and sibling relationships, Goldman explained. But as treatment progressed, I became concerned about her inability to recognize her sisters as full individuals with their own valid needs and feelings. Goldman testified that she had observed Jessica describe incidents of parental attention to her sisters not as a normal part of family life, but as personal attacks on her status, quoting Jessica as saying, "Every time they look at Nicole or Leslie, it's like they're choosing them instead of me." Dr. Goldman's most significant testimony concerned warning signs she had documented in her treatment notes and shared with Michael and Sarah Hermar months before the murders. I became concerned when Jessica described a fantasy of her sisters disappearing and how much better her life would be without them, Goldman testified. This wasn't expressed as a momentary wish during an argument, but as a recurring thought she returned to repeatedly across multiple sessions. Goldman had recommended more intensive family therapy and a psychiatric evaluation to rule out emerging personality disorders, but Jessica had become increasingly resistant to treatment, eventually refusing to participate meaningfully in sessions. I warned her parents that her fixation on being the only child was concerning and that her emotional detachment when discussing her sisters suggested potential for escalation, Goldman stated, visibly distressed, as she acknowledged the tragic outcome her professional concerns had foreshadowed. Digital forensics expert Terrence Wong returned to the stand to provide more detailed analysis of Jessica's search history, focusing specifically on the progression of her research in the final days before the murders. Wong presented a visualization showing how Jessica's searches had become increasingly specific and action-oriented, moving from general information about rifles to detailed queries about executing and concealing a shooting. On October 27th, 3 days before the murders, the user searched how to make gunshot quieter in woods, followed by best place in park to not be seen, Wong testified, displaying the actual search queries on a screen for the jury. On October 29th, the day before the murders, searches included how to clean fingerprints from gun and do kids get same punishment as adults for murder. This progression, Wong explained, demonstrated not only planning, but awareness of potential consequences, directly challenging the defense's position that Jessica had been unable to understand the implications of her actions. One of the most powerful witnesses for the prosecution was Jessica's former babysitter, Olivia Phan, who testified about incidents she had witnessed in the year before the murders. Phan described finding Nicole's artwork torn up in the trash after it had been praised by her parents, discovering that Jessica had deliberately broken Leslie's swimming trophies and blamed it on the family cat, and overhearing Jessica tell her sisters they were useless and ruined everything. The most disturbing incident Phan recounted occurred approximately 6 months before the murders, when she had entered Jessica's bedroom to find her cutting up family photographs, systematically removing Nicole and Leslie from the images while leaving her parents and herself intact. When I asked what she was doing, she looked at me very calmly and said, "Making the pictures right," Phan testified, her voice breaking slightly. It seemed so deliberate and cold, not like a typical angry outburst. The defense case began with testimony from Dr. Samuel Al-Jamil, a neurodevelopmental psychologist specializing in adolescent brain development, who presented detailed information about the biological immaturity of the adolescent brain. Using MRI images and scientific studies, Dr. Al-Jamil explained that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for judgment, impulse control, and understanding long-term consequences, remains underdeveloped until the mid-20s, with particularly significant development occurring between ages 12 and 16. At 12 years old, Jessica Hermar's brain was simply not capable of the kind of adult reasoning and impulse control that the prosecution suggests, Al-Jamil testified. The neural pathways that allow us to fully appreciate the permanence of our actions, to regulate our emotional responses, and to truly understand the impact of harm to others are physically incomplete at this stage of development. Under cross-examination from Assistant District Attorney Baker, however, Dr. Al-Jamil was forced to acknowledge that brain development exists on a spectrum and that capacity for understanding varies significantly among adolescents of the same chronological age. Baker pressed the expert on how he reconciled his general statements about adolescent brain development with the specific evidence of Jessica's methodical planning. "Doctor, how do you explain the fact that this supposedly impulsive, neurologically immature defendant conducted weeks of research, created alibis, selected a remote location, concealed evidence, and maintained a consistent false narrative during initial questioning?" Baker asked. "Doesn't that level of forethought and calculation suggest a capacity for planning and understanding consequences that contradicts your testimony about her brain's limitations?" Al-Jamil conceded that the specifics of Jessica's actions indicated higher executive functioning than might be expected, though he maintained that her age still significantly impacted her moral reasoning and impulse control. The defense called several of Jessica's teachers to testify about her behavior and performance at school, attempting to establish a pattern of unaddressed psychological and emotional needs. Her seventh-grade science teacher, Robert Chen, described Jessica as bright but withdrawn, noting that she often seemed frustrated when she didn't receive immediate recognition for her work. Jessica would complete assignments perfectly, but then become visibly upset if I didn't acknowledge her work before other students, Chen testified. There was an intensity to her need for validation that seemed different from typical academic ambition. Her English teacher, Melissa Jackson, testified about the creative writing assignment that had concerned her, a story about a girl who could make people disappear, explaining that while she had found the content disturbing, such dark themes were not uncommon in adolescent creative writing, and she had not considered it a serious warning sign at the time. Child psychiatrist Dr. Sophia Patel, who had evaluated Jessica after her arrest but had not treated her before the crimes, provided expert testimony about the psychological impact of perceived parental favoritism on developing children. When a child consistently perceives that siblings receive more attention, affection, or recognition, regardless of whether that perception is accurate, it can create profound psychological distress, Dr. Patel explained. In a child already predisposed to emotional regulation difficulties, this perception can develop into a fixed belief system where the siblings are viewed as competitors for limited parental resources rather than as family members. Dr. Patel suggested that Jessica's actions, while extreme, could be understood as the outcome of untreated psychological issues exacerbated by environmental stressors and developmental limitations rather than evidence of irredeemable moral corruption. During cross-examination, Baker challenged Dr. Patel's characterization of Jessica's mindset as a response to perceived parental favoritism, displaying the computer searches that showed Jessica researching how to get away with murder. Doctor, would you agree that researching the legal consequences for juvenile offenders suggests an understanding that the planned actions were wrong and punishable? Baker asked. And doesn't the deliberate attempt to create an alibi indicate awareness of both moral and legal boundaries? Dr. Patel acknowledged that the searches suggested some level of understanding, but maintained that Jessica's comprehension of the true meaning of death and the full impact of her actions was still limited by her developmental stage, regardless of her intellectual grasp of certain consequences. The most controversial testimony came from Dr. James Barrett, a forensic psychiatrist who had conducted extensive interviews with Jessica after her arrest and reviewed all available evidence about her mental state before and after the crimes. Dr. Barrett presented a diagnosis of conduct disorder with limited prosocial emotions, a clinical classification used for children who show severe behavioral problems and significantly reduced capacity for empathy and remorse. This is not simply a child who was jealous or angry, Barrett testified. Jessica exhibits a pervasive pattern of callous and unemotional traits that significantly impair her ability to form normal attachments or experience appropriate empathy. Barrett explained that while this diagnosis did not absolve Jessica of responsibility, it provided crucial context for understanding why conventional social and moral deterrents had failed to prevent her from acting on her homicidal ideation. Dr. Barrett's testimony included direct quotes from his clinical interviews with Jessica that stunned the courtroom. When I asked Jessica how she felt about her sisters now, she replied, "I don't really feel anything about them. It's quiet now without them, which is better," Barrett reported. When asked if she understood that Nicole and Leslie would never grow up, go to college, or have families of their own, She responded, "That's just how it is. Everyone dies eventually." These statements, Barrett explained, reflected not just developmental immaturity, but a fundamental deficit in emotional processing and moral reasoning that should be considered when evaluating her culpability. Jessica understands the physical fact that she caused her sister's deaths, but she cannot process the emotional and moral dimensions of that act in the way an adult, or even many adolescents, would, he concluded. Assistant District Attorney Baker's cross-examination of Dr. Barrett was meticulous and strategic, focusing on distinguishing between capacity for empathy and choice to exercise empathy. "Doctor, isn't it true that individuals with the traits you've described can selectively demonstrate empathy when it serves their interests?" Baker asked, displaying Jessica's journal entries that showed detailed awareness of her parents' emotional states when she felt they were neglecting her. Barrett acknowledged that individuals with conduct disorders often show selective empathy, particularly regarding their own interests and needs. Baker then presented evidence of Jessica's ability to maintain friendships at school, follow rules when motivated to do so, and express appropriate emotions in situations where she felt adequately recognized, arguing that these behaviors demonstrated capacity for normal social functioning when it aligned with her desires, suggesting choice rather than incapacity in her actions toward her sisters. The testimony phase of the trial concluded with an unusual development: Jessica Hermar's decision to testify in her own defense against the strong recommendation of her legal team. Judge Ramirez conducted a thorough competency evaluation before allowing Jessica to take the stand, ensuring she understood the implications of waiving her Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination. Jessica, dressed in a pale blue dress with her hair pulled back by a headband, appeared composed as she was sworn in, her small stature requiring an adjustment to the witness chair height. The courtroom fell silent as she began to speak, her voice clear but emotionless as she described the events leading up to her sister's deaths. Jessica's testimony, delivered with unsettling composure, confirmed rather than refuted many elements of the prosecution's case. She acknowledged conducting the computer searches, taking her father's rifle, and leading her sisters to the remote location with the intention of killing them. When asked by her attorney why she had done this, Jessica replied with chilling directness, "They were always the special ones. Everything was always about them. Nicole's art, Leslie's swimming. No matter what I did, I was never good enough, never special enough." She described feeling invisible in her own home and coming to believe that removing her sisters was the only way to secure the attention and recognition she craved. "I just wanted to be the only one," she said, her voice remaining steady while her parents wept openly in the gallery. "I wanted to be the daughter, not just one of the daughters." Assistant District Attorney Baker's cross-examination of Jessica revealed the depth of premeditation involved in the murders. Jessica admitted to practicing with the rifle when her parents were not home, researching the park layout to find a suitably remote location, and deliberately concealing her plans from everyone around her. When Baker asked if she understood that killing her sisters would permanently end their lives, that they would never grow up, never have their own experiences, never see their parents again, Jessica's response sent a chill through the courtroom. That was the point. I would be the only one left. When asked if she felt remorse for taking her sisters' lives, Jessica paused before answering, "I feel bad that Mom and Dad are sad, but I don't miss Nicole and Leslie." This testimony, while potentially damaging to her defense, provided the jury with direct insight into Jessica's mindset that no expert witness could offer with equal authority. After 3 weeks of testimony, the trial of Jessica Hermar moved to closing arguments on March 17, 2025, in a courtroom filled to capacity with legal observers, selected media representatives, and family members. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation as Assistant District Attorney Emma Baker rose to deliver the prosecution's final address to the jury. Baker's closing argument methodically reconstructed the timeline of Jessica's actions, from her initial computer searches about rifles through the planning stages and execution of the murders, projecting a detailed visual presentation that integrated physical evidence, digital forensics, and expert testimony into a cohesive narrative of premeditation and intent. What the evidence has shown beyond any reasonable doubt, Baker told the jury, is that Jessica Hermar made a deliberate decision to kill her sisters, researched how to do it effectively, selected a location to minimize the chance of interference, and executed her plan with precision and determination. Baker directly addressed the defense's primary argument about Jessica's neurological immaturity, acknowledging the science of adolescent brain development while arguing that it failed to explain or excuse the specific actions in this case. The defense wants you to believe that Jessica lacked the capacity to understand the wrongfulness of her actions or their permanent consequences because she was only 12, Baker said, but Jessica's own actions tell a different story. Her computer searches about legal consequences for juvenile offenders show she understood what she was planning was wrong and punishable. Her efforts to create an alibi and conceal evidence demonstrate awareness of wrongdoing. Her methodical planning over weeks reveals not impulsivity, but sustained, deliberate intention. Baker concluded by reminding the jury that while Jessica's age was a factor to consider, the law required them to judge her based on her actions and the evidence of her understanding, not solely on chronological age or general developmental patterns. Defense attorney Rebecca Sandoval's closing argument centered on contextualizing Jessica's actions within her developmental limitations and psychological distress, urging the jury to consider not just what happened, but why it happened, and whether Jessica truly possessed the capacity for adult-level moral reasoning. The human brain at 12 years old is biologically incapable of the kind of mature judgment we expect from adults, Sandoval emphasized, referencing Dr. Al-Jamil's testimony about prefrontal cortex development. Jessica's actions, however disturbing, emerged from a perfect storm of neurological immaturity, psychological vulnerability, and environmental triggers that created a distorted reality in which she could not properly evaluate consequences or alternative solutions to her perceived problems. Sandoval suggested that finding Jessica guilty of a lesser charge would acknowledge the gravity of her actions while recognizing the mitigating factors of her youth and mental state. Sandoval's most emotionally resonant argument came when she addressed the jury directly about the purpose of the justice system when dealing with child offenders. We are confronted with an incomprehensible tragedy. 2 beautiful young lives ended far too soon, she acknowledged. But we must ask ourselves, what purpose is served by treating a 12-year-old child, regardless of her actions, as if she possessed the full moral and cognitive capacity of an adult? Jessica requires intensive psychiatric treatment and supervision in a secure juvenile facility, not warehousing in an adult prison system designed for fully formed adult minds. Sandoval concluded by asking the jury to find Jessica guilty of second-degree murder or manslaughter, charges that would acknowledge her actions while recognizing the diminished capacity under which she had operated. Judge Eleanor Ramirez delivered detailed instructions to the jury before they began deliberations, explaining the legal definitions of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter, as well as the special circumstances allegations of multiple victims and lying in wait that the prosecution had included. Ramirez instructed the jury to consider Jessica's age as a factor in evaluating her mental state, but emphasized that age alone was not determinative of legal capacity. The law recognizes that minors may be capable of forming the specific intent required for certain crimes, depending on the individual's development, understanding, and actions, Ramirez explained. You must evaluate the evidence of Jessica Hermar's planning, actions, and statements to determine whether she acted with the required mental state for each potential charge, taking her age into consideration, but not treating it as automatically precluding any particular finding. The jury deliberated for 4 full days, requesting several readbacks of testimony focusing on Jessica's computer searches, her statements during police interrogation, and the expert testimony about adolescent brain development. On the morning of March 22nd, the jury notified the court they had reached a verdict, and Judge Ramirez reconvened the proceedings. As Jessica sat between her attorneys, appearing small and young in her navy blue dress with white collar, the jury forewoman, a middle school teacher in her 50s, stood to deliver the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder of Nicole Hermar, we find the defendant, Jessica Hermar, guilty, she announced, her voice steady but somber. On the charge of first-degree murder of Leslie Hermar, we find the defendant, Jessica Hermar, guilty. On the special circumstance allegation of multiple victims, we find this allegation to be true. On the special circumstance allegation of lying in wait, we find this allegation to be true. As the verdict was read, the courtroom remained eerily silent, with none of the typical reactions often seen at the conclusion of high-profile trials. Michael and Sarah Hermar sat holding hands, tears streaming down their faces but making no sound as they heard the legal resolution of the tragedy that had destroyed their family. Jessica's expression remained unchanged as she listened to the jury's decision, her face displaying neither surprise nor distress at the outcome. Judge Ramirez thanked the jury for their service and scheduled the sentencing hearing for April 15th, ordering Jessica to remain in juvenile detention despite her adult conviction, given her age and the facility's greater capacity to address her specific needs while awaiting sentencing. The reaction to the verdict outside the courtroom was immediate and polarized, reflecting the deep philosophical divisions the case had exposed in the criminal justice system's approach to juvenile offenders. Legal commentators on television news programs debated whether the jury had properly weighed Jessica's developmental limitations against her actions, with some arguing that a 12-year-old should never be held to the standard of first-degree murder regardless of the evidence, while others maintained that the methodical nature of Jessica's planning demonstrated capacity for the requisite intent. Child development experts expressed concern about the precedent set by trying and convicting such a young defendant as an adult, while victims' rights advocates pointed to the premeditated nature of the killings as justification for the outcome. In the days following the verdict, several jurors spoke anonymously to the press, revealing the difficult deliberations that had led to their unanimous decision. "We struggled enormously with Jessica's age," one juror told the San Diego Union-Tribune. "None of us wanted to believe a 12-year-old could form the kind of intent needed for first-degree murder. But when we reviewed the evidence, the searches about hiding evidence and legal consequences, the methodical planning over weeks, her own testimony about wanting to be the only one, we couldn't reconcile that with impulsive action or lack of understanding." Another juror described being particularly influenced by Jessica's computer search for "Will people think accident if kids shoot someone?" explaining, "That search showed she understood not just that killing was wrong, but that she might avoid full consequences if it appeared accidental. That level of calculation is not what you expect from someone without understanding." The verdict created unprecedented challenges for the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, which had never before had to develop a custody plan for an offender so young facing an adult sentence for a crime of this magnitude. Prison officials consulted with juvenile justice specialists, mental health professionals, and security experts to determine how to handle Jessica's case, recognizing that traditional adult incarceration was inappropriate for a 12-year-old regardless of her conviction. Advocacy groups filed amicus briefs arguing that placing Jessica in an adult facility at any point would constitute cruel and unusual punishment given her age, while others contended that the juvenile system was inadequately equipped to handle an offender who had demonstrated such calculated violence. Michael and Sarah Hermar faced their own painful dilemma in the wake of the verdict, torn between their grief for Nicole and Leslie and their concern for Jessica's future. In their only public statement following the trial, released through their attorney, they expressed this impossible position. "We have lost all three of our daughters, 2 to death and 1 to an act we cannot comprehend. While we believe Jessica must face consequences for her actions, we also recognize that she is our child and still developing. We ask for privacy as we continue to navigate this unimaginable tragedy and determine how we can support Jessica while honoring the memories of Nicole and Leslie." Their statement reflected the complex reality of parents whose surviving child had murdered their other children, a situation for which there was no roadmap and no precedent in their community. As the sentencing date approached, legal experts speculated about the range of possibilities Judge Ramirez might consider. Under California law, Jessica's conviction for first-degree murder with special circumstances technically made her eligible for sentences up to life without parole, though recent Supreme Court rulings had limited the application of such sentences to juvenile offenders. Most legal observers expected a lengthy, determinate sentence with provisions for psychiatric treatment and rehabilitation, followed by extended supervision upon release, recognizing both the severity of the crime and Jessica's youth. What no one anticipated was the unprecedented sentence that Judge Ramirez would ultimately deliver, a decision that would thrust the case back into the national spotlight and ignite a constitutional controversy that would reshape juvenile justice in America. On April 15, 2025, the Hermar case reached its legal conclusion in a sentencing hearing that lasted nearly 4 hours, during which Judge Ramirez heard statements from Jessica's parents, her psychiatric evaluators, and Jessica herself. Michael Hermar addressed the court first, his voice breaking as he described the ocean of loss his family had experienced and his continued inability to reconcile the daughter he had raised with the child who had methodically killed her sisters. "I look at Jessica and still see my little girl," he said, "but I also see the person who took Nicole and Leslie from us forever. No parent should ever have to make sense of this contradiction." Sarah Hermar chose not to speak directly, instead having her statement read by a victim advocate, in which she described nightmares where she found herself running through the woods trying to reach her daughters, always waking before she could save them. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Jessica spoke briefly in a composed voice that many observers found disturbing in its lack of emotional affect. "I know everyone thinks I should say I'm sorry," she said, looking directly at Judge Ramirez rather than at her parents. "But I did what I wanted to do. Nicole and Leslie always got everything, and now they don't get anything. I just wanted to be the special one for once." This statement, delivered without apparent remorse or recognition of the human impact of her actions, visibly affected everyone in the courtroom, including Judge Ramirez, whose expression hardened as she listened to Jessica's words. The statement would later be cited in the judge's sentencing explanation as evidence of Jessica's continued danger to society and lack of rehabilitative potential. Judge Ramirez began her sentencing statement by acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the case and the complex intersection of juvenile development, psychological factors, and the severity of premeditated double homicide. She reviewed the evidence presented during trial, Jessica's psychiatric evaluations, and the impact statements from the victim's family and community. The court recognizes the defendant's chronological age of 12 years at the time of these crimes, Ramirez stated. However, The court cannot ignore the extraordinary level of premeditation, the calculated efforts to avoid detection, and the complete lack of remorse displayed both at the time of the murders and throughout these proceedings, including the statement made today. Ramirez noted that Jessica's psychiatric evaluations indicated treatment-resistant conduct disorder with limited prosocial emotions, a condition associated with poor outcomes, even with intensive intervention. Then, in a ruling that would send shockwaves through the legal community, Judge Ramirez pronounced her sentence. It is the judgment and sentence of this court that the defendant, Jessica Hermar, having been found guilty by a jury of her peers of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, shall be put to death by lethal injection at a time to be determined by the state of California. As gasps filled the courtroom, Ramirez continued, her voice growing harder as she addressed Jessica directly. The cold, calculated nature of your actions and your chilling statement to this court today demonstrates a depravity that this court must answer in the strongest possible terms. The judge acknowledged that existing Supreme Court precedent prohibited the execution of offenders who were under 18 at the time of their crimes, but stated her belief that this case warranted a re-evaluation of that precedent, given the exceptional depravity and calculation demonstrated by Jessica. The unprecedented death sentence for a 12-year-old immediately triggered automatic appeals and emergency motions from Jessica's defense team, who called the sentence blatantly unconstitutional and a reflection of emotional reaction rather than judicial reasoning. Legal experts across the political spectrum expressed shock at Ramirez's ruling, with even staunch supporters of capital punishment questioning the application of the death penalty to a defendant so young, regardless of the crime's severity. Constitutional scholars noted that the sentence appeared to deliberately challenge established Supreme Court precedent in Roper v. Simmons, 2005, which prohibited capital punishment for crimes committed by those under 18, suggesting Ramirez intended to force a reconsideration of that ruling through the appeals process. Within hours of the sentencing, the American Civil Liberties Union, the Juvenile Law Center, and a coalition of child advocacy organizations filed amicus briefs supporting the defense's emergency appeal, arguing that the execution of a 12-year-old would violate not only U.S. constitutional standards, but international human rights laws and norms. The California Attorney General's office found itself in the unusual position of having to respond to an appeal of a sentence that many within the office privately considered indefensible, leading to internal debates about how vigorously to defend Judge Ramirez's ruling through the appeals process. Governor Elisa Mendez issued a statement expressing serious concerns about the constitutionality and morality of imposing capital punishment on a 12-year-old defendant, and directed the state's legal team to thoroughly evaluate all aspects of this unprecedented sentence. The national media coverage of the sentence was immediate and overwhelming, with legal analysts, child development experts, and ethical philosophers debating the case on television, radio, and online platforms. Public opinion polls showed Americans deeply divided on the issue, with approximately 30% supporting the death sentence for Jessica given the calculated nature of her crimes, 45% opposing capital punishment for any juvenile regardless of the offense, and 25% unsure or believing the decision should be left to the courts. The case quickly became a flashpoint in broader political debates about juvenile justice, with conservative commentators arguing that heinous crimes warranted serious consequences regardless of age, while progressive voices maintained that neurological development and capacity for rehabilitation should be paramount in cases involving children. Jessica Hermar herself was immediately transferred to a special secure unit at the California Institution for Women, pending the outcome of her appeals. Though officials emphasized that she would be housed separately from the adult population and would receive continued educational and psychological services, appropriate for her age. Prison officials described the arrangement as temporary and extraordinary, acknowledging that no protocols existed for managing a 12-year-old female death row inmate, a situation they had never anticipated facing. As Jessica began what promised to be years of appeals and legal challenges, the extraordinary case of the San Diego sister killer had transformed from a local family tragedy into a national reckoning with the most fundamental questions about justice, development, accountability, and the limits of punishment in a civilized society. The death sentence imposed on 12-year-old Jessica Hermar ignited an unprecedented legal battle that would ultimately reach the United States Supreme Court in what became one of the most closely watched cases in the court's modern history. Within 48 hours of Judge Ramirez's shocking sentence, the California Court of Appeal issued an emergency stay suspending implementation of the death sentence while the appeals process unfolded. The three-judge panel cited substantial constitutional questions raised by the sentence and expressed particular concern about Judge Ramirez's explicit statement of the sentence's justification, language the panel described as raising serious questions about judicial neutrality and the potential for vindictiveness in sentencing. This initial appellate action signaled what would become years of complex legal challenges to both Jessica's conviction as an adult and the constitutionality of her sentence. Legal scholars from across the ideological spectrum weighed in on the case, with most expressing serious doubts about the constitutionality of the death sentence. Even if one believes in capital punishment for the most heinous adult offenders, the execution of a 12-year-old child fundamentally contradicts our evolving standards of decency and our understanding of brain development, wrote conservative legal scholar Professor Robert Finley in a widely circulated law review article. The Supreme Court has consistently recognized the reduced culpability of juvenile offenders, and nothing in this case, despite its horrific nature, justifies abandoning that principle. Liberal legal commentators were even more forceful in their condemnation, with the Harvard Law Review publishing a special issue dedicated to examining the Hermar case and its implications for juvenile justice, featuring articles that universally condemned the death sentence as unconstitutional regardless of the crime's severity. As the legal challenges proceeded, the public remained deeply divided on the appropriate consequences for Jessica's actions. Victims' rights advocates and some conservative commentators argued that the premeditated nature of the murders and Jessica's continued lack of remorse justified exceptional punishment, while child welfare organizations and progressive voices maintained that no crime committed by a 12-year-old, no matter how calculating or horrific, warranted adult punishment, let alone execution. Public opinion polls showed that while most Americans opposed executing Jessica, a significant minority, approximately 30%, supported the death sentence, reflecting profound disagreements about moral development, criminal responsibility, and the purpose of punishment in cases involving juvenile offenders. The Hermar case quickly became a rallying point for advocacy organizations on both sides of the juvenile justice debate. The Children's Defense Fund and similar organizations launched the Kids Are Different campaign, highlighting scientific research on adolescent brain development and arguing that the justice system must account for the fundamental neurological differences between juvenile and adult offenders regardless of the crime. Concurrently, victims' rights groups organized the Justice for Nicole and Leslie movement, emphasizing the calculated nature of the murders and arguing that certain crimes are so heinous that age should not be a barrier to appropriate punishment. These competing movements reflected the complex moral questions at the heart of the case, forcing Americans to confront difficult truths about childhood development, accountability, and the limits of both rehabilitation and punishment. While the legal battle over Jessica's sentence continued, Michael and Sarah Hermar faced the devastating task of rebuilding some semblance of life, after losing all three of their daughters, 2 to death and 1 to the justice system. 6 months after the sentencing, Sarah Hermar gave an interview to the San Diego Union-Tribune, her only public statement since the trial, in which she described the impossible position of simultaneously grieving Nicole and Leslie while grappling with Jessica's actions and fate. "There are no words for this kind of loss," she said. "We live with ghosts, the ghosts of the daughters we lost, and the ghost of who we thought Jessica was." The Hermars had begun visiting Jessica monthly at the California Institution for Women, visits that Sarah described as surreal and heartbreaking, noting that Jessica still showed little understanding of or remorse for her actions, often discussing her daily activities in detention without acknowledging why she was there. The case progressed through the appellate system with unusual speed, given its exceptional nature and the substantial constitutional questions it raised. In December 2026, the California Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the death sentence was unconstitutional under both state and federal law, citing the U.S. Supreme Court's precedent in Roper v. Simmons, and noting that if the Constitution prohibits the execution of a 17-year-old, it unquestionably forbids the execution of a 12-year-old. The court affirmed Jessica's conviction for first-degree murder with special circumstances, but remanded the case for resentencing with explicit instructions that the sentence must provide meaningful opportunity for rehabilitation and eventual release, in accordance with the U.S. Supreme Court's juvenile sentencing jurisprudence. This ruling was widely expected, but the case did not end there. San Diego County District Attorney Carlos Mendez, under significant political pressure, announced his intention to appeal the sentencing issue to the U.S. Supreme Court. In a move that surprised many legal observers, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case in its 2027 to 2028 term, taking the unusual step of limiting its review solely to the question of whether the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment categorically forbids imposing the death penalty on a defendant who was 12 years old at the time of the offense. The court's decision to grant certiorari generated intense speculation about whether some justices were prepared to reconsider or narrow Roper v. Simmons in light of a case involving such calculated violence by an exceptionally young offender. Legal analysts noted that the court's composition had changed significantly since Roper, with several justices who might be more receptive to arguments that the most heinous juvenile crimes warranted exceptions to the categorical ban on executing minors. On November 7, 2027, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in Hermar v. California, in what became one of the most closely watched proceedings in the court's recent history. The courtroom was filled to capacity, with the Hermar parents present, along with representatives from numerous advocacy organizations on both sides of the issue. California Deputy Attorney General Maria Suarez presented the state's case, arguing that while age should generally be a mitigating factor in sentencing, the exceptional nature of Jessica's crimes, the calculated planning, the clear understanding of wrongfulness demonstrated by her computer searches, and her continued lack of remorse, justified reconsidering whether a categorical ban on juvenile execution was appropriate in all circumstances. The foundational premise of Roper was that juvenile offenders are categorically less culpable due to immaturity, impulsivity, and susceptibility to peer pressure, Suarez argued. Jessica Hermar's crimes demonstrate none of these characteristics. Her actions were planned, deliberate, and entirely self-generated. Jessica's attorney, prominent appellate lawyer Daniel Hoffman, countered with arguments grounded in both constitutional precedent and neuroscience, emphasizing that the very capacity for the moral reasoning necessary to justify capital punishment is biologically undeveloped in early adolescence. The state asks this court to create an exception to Roper based on the nature of the crime rather than the nature of the offender, Hoffman argued. But the central insight of this court's juvenile sentencing jurisprudence is that children are constitutionally different from adults in their level of culpability, not because of what they do, but because of who they are developmentally. Hoffman presented amicus briefs from the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychological Association, and numerous neuroscientists detailing the biological immaturity of the 12-year-old brain, particularly in regions responsible for impulse control, consequence evaluation, and moral reasoning. The justices' questions during oral arguments revealed deep divisions within the court about how to balance the horrific nature of Jessica's crimes against her indisputable neurological immaturity. Conservative justices pressed Hoffman on whether there should be any categorical bans based on age alone, suggesting that individual assessment might be more appropriate than bright-line rules. If a 12-year-old demonstrates the planning and awareness that Jessica Hermer did, shouldn't that individual capacity be what matters rather than chronological age? Asked one justice. Liberal justices, conversely, challenged the state's attorney on the fundamental premise that executing any child could be constitutional, with one asking pointedly, "Is there any age at which the state concedes an execution would be categorically unconstitutional, or are we to evaluate 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds on the same case-by-case basis you're advocating for this 12-year-old?" On June 15, 2028, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Hermar v. California, a 6-3 decision that reaffirmed the constitutional prohibition against imposing the death penalty on juvenile offenders. Writing for the majority, Justice Eleanor Hamilton stated, "While the crimes committed by Jessica Hermar are undoubtedly heinous and demonstrate a disturbing level of premeditation, the Constitution's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment must account for the fundamental reality that children are neurologically different from adults in ways that diminish their culpability, regardless of the severity of their crimes." The court rejected the state's argument for a case-by-case approach based on the nature of the offense, holding that the Eighth Amendment requires categorical protection for juvenile offenders from society's most severe and irreversible punishment, not because of what they did, but because of who they are developmentally. The majority opinion specifically addressed Jessica's calculated planning and apparent understanding of consequences, acknowledging these as unusual for her age, but maintaining that even precocious comprehension of certain aspects of criminal behavior does not equate to the moral and emotional development necessary to justify capital punishment. The opinion concluded with a passage that would be widely quoted in subsequent juvenile justice debates. "A civilized society does not execute its children, no matter how grievously they have erred. Our Constitution demands that we recognize the capacity for change and growth that is inherent in youth, even when confronted with crimes that test the limits of our compassion and understanding." The court remanded the case for resentencing consistent with its juvenile sentencing precedents, effectively ensuring that Jessica would receive a sentence that included the possibility of parole at some point in her future. The dissenting opinion, written by Justice Marcus Sullivan and joined by two other justices, argued that the categorical approach adopted by the majority failed to account for the rare cases where juvenile offenders demonstrate adult-like calculation and moral comprehension. The majority creates a rule that treats a 17-year-old impulsively following peers into a robbery gone wrong identically to a 12-year-old who spends weeks researching how to kill, successfully executes that plan, and maintains 3 years later that she would do it again, Sullivan wrote. This false equivalence does not serve justice, the Constitution, or even a coherent understanding of adolescent development, which recognizes that chronological age is an imperfect proxy for moral and cognitive maturity. The dissent proposed instead a modified approach that would maintain a presumption against executing juveniles, but allow for case-specific evaluation of offenders who demonstrated exceptional premeditation and understanding. Following the Supreme Court's decision, Jessica Hermar was resentenced in San Diego County Superior Court to 2 consecutive life terms with the possibility of parole after 25 years, the maximum sentence permissible under California law for a juvenile offender in light of the court's ruling. Judge Maria Gonzalez, who handled the resentencing after Judge Ramirez had recused herself from further participation in the case, emphasized that while the sentence provided a theoretical opportunity for release, parole would only be granted upon clear and convincing evidence of rehabilitation, including full acknowledgement of responsibility, genuine remorse, and demonstration of profound change in character and understanding. The resentencing provided the legal resolution to Jessica's case, but the broader questions it had raised about juvenile justice, brain development, and the limits of punishment and rehabilitation continued to reverberate through American society. The Hermar case had profound and lasting impacts on the juvenile justice system nationwide. Within 2 years of the Supreme Court's decision, 17 states passed legislation explicitly prohibiting sentencing juvenile offenders to life without parole regardless of the crime, going beyond the court's requirement of parole eligibility to establish presumptions in favor of rehabilitation-focused sentences for all juvenile offenders. Other states took a different approach, strengthening victim impact considerations in juvenile sentencing and establishing stringent criteria for parole eligibility that emphasized proven rehabilitation and genuine remorse. These divergent responses reflected continuing societal disagreements about the appropriate balance between accountability and recognition of developmental factors in juvenile justice, disagreements that the Hermar case had brought into sharp focus. The academic and scientific community responded to the case with increased research into juvenile violence and brain development, with particular attention to the rare cases where very young offenders commit premeditated violent crimes. The Hermar Initiative, a multi-university research project funded by the National Institutes of Health, began a longitudinal study of juvenile offenders who had committed serious violent crimes, tracking their neurological development, response to treatment, and cognitive and moral reasoning over time. Preliminary findings published in 2030 suggested that while all juvenile offenders showed significant brain development through adolescence, there were measurable differences in empathy processing and moral reasoning between those who committed impulsive crimes and those like Jessica, who engaged in calculated violence, differences that had implications for both treatment approaches and risk assessment. But that still supported the conclusion that all juvenile offenders had significant capacity for change, given appropriate intervention. For Michael and Sarah Hermar, the legal resolution brought little emotional closure. They continued their monthly visits to Jessica at the California Institution for Women's Juvenile Offender Program, a specialized unit developed in the wake of her case to house female juvenile offenders sentenced as adults. In a 2030 interview with Psychology Today, Michael described the impossible emotional terrain they navigated. "We still love Jessica because she's our daughter, but we will never understand or accept what she did to Nicole and Leslie. We visit her because she's our child, but we also visit the cemetery every week because Nicole and Leslie are our children too, and they will never grow up because of Jessica's actions." The Hermars established the Nicole and Leslie Foundation, dedicated to early intervention for children showing signs of pathological jealousy and severe conduct disorders, hoping to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Jessica Hermar herself remained an enigmatic figure at the center of the case that bore her name. As she moved through adolescence in the structured environment of juvenile detention, psychological evaluations showed minimal progress in developing empathy or remorse. Her academic performance was exceptional, with reports indicating she had completed high school equivalency at 15 and begun college coursework through a prison education program, demonstrating the cognitive abilities that had enabled her methodical planning. However, treatment providers consistently noted her continued emotional detachment when discussing her sisters or her crimes, describing her approach to therapy as intellectualized compliance without emotional engagement. One therapist reported that Jessica seemed to view her treatment program as a series of obstacles to overcome rather than an opportunity for genuine growth, raising serious questions about her potential for meaningful rehabilitation despite her intelligence and academic success. By 2035, the Hermar case had become a standard component of law school curricula nationwide, used to teach concepts ranging from constitutional law and juvenile justice to forensic psychology and neurological development. Legal scholars generally viewed the Supreme Court's decision as a significant reinforcement of the principle that juvenile offenders are constitutionally different from adults, while acknowledging the legitimate questions raised by cases involving premeditated violence by very young offenders. The case had also entered the broader cultural consciousness, referenced in television dramas, documentaries, and literature, exploring the darkest aspects of childhood development and family dynamics. A 2034 Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Invisible Child, drew loosely on the case to explore themes of sibling rivalry, parental attention, and the development of empathy in children, bringing these psychological complexities to a wider audience than the legal proceedings alone had reached. Jessica would first become eligible for parole consideration in 2050, when she would be 37 years old, having spent more than two-thirds of her life in custody for the murders of her sisters. Whether she would ever demonstrate the remorse, understanding, and rehabilitation necessary for release remained uncertain, with her annual psychological evaluations showing continued academic and behavioral compliance but persistent deficits in emotional processing and empathy. The parole board would face the daunting task of evaluating not only her institutional record, but the fundamental question of whether someone who had committed such calculated violence at such a young age could ever be safely reintegrated into society, regardless of the intervening years of development and treatment. The Hermar case ultimately left American society with more questions than answers about juvenile justice, brain development, and the capacity for rehabilitation. It forced a national conversation about how to balance accountability for horrific crimes against recognition of children's developmental limitations, how to weigh the needs of victims against the unique status of juvenile offenders, and how to design a justice system that both protects society and acknowledges the profound differences between adult and juvenile criminality. In this sense, the legal resolution of Jessica Hermar's case represented not an endpoint, but the beginning of a deeper societal reckoning with some of the most difficult questions in criminal justice, questions that continued to challenge our understanding of childhood, moral development, culpability, and the possibility of redemption, even for those who have committed the most disturbing acts imaginable.